Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Novohrodivka, where the Russians started an advance here to the northeast of the village, consolidating their gains here to the northeast by advancing here in the southwest, which allows them to strengthen the flanks of this advance, preventing it from becoming its own salient within the Ukrainian salient. So we're seeing continuous attempts by Russians to advance here in the northeast of Novohrodivka and to the west of Verbove. It seems that the reports of Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing from Verbove may be premature, as we still have no indication that the Russians really are going through empty fields, but instead that they are walking through the areas with Ukrainian defenders, where the Ukrainian soldiers are in trenches trying to prevent the Russian advances, and heavy fights take place for these advances to take place, which shows that rather than the Ukrainians withdrawing from Verbove, it is likely that they instead had reinforcements from the north to prevent the Russian advances that we have seen here in the south. So rather than withdrawing their gains, they're doubling down and trying to hold on to their positions and prevent further Russian advances. But the Russians have sent further and further reinforcements to this area, which simply outnumbers and outmaneuvers the Ukrainians, and it makes it too difficult for the Ukrainians to deal with that, and this is why we're seeing these Russian advances all throughout the Robotyne direction. We then move to the far north, where the Russians have made advances here to the west of Dibrova. We've seen that the fighting here has taken place at the outskirts of the village for a very long time, for many months now, if not a year, and the Russians are now trying to move westwards from this position. We saw how they first started this push west of Kreminna, where they captured this territory here within the Donetsk Oblast, where they moved towards Zarishne and Torske. They managed to get a foothold within the village, or so it was reported, but then it turned out that the Ukrainians claimed it was friendly fire. So in the end, we don't really know for sure, but they did reach the outskirts of the village, and that allowed the Russians to then start attacking towards the Serebets River. However, it did not receive the desired results of the Russian army, so they started moving on the active defense positions here to the north, trying to establish and protect their flanks, and now they've started moving in the direction of Terni to strengthen the northern parts of the salient to create a second one here, and they'll likely expand it southwards to expand the current one that they had here in the south. All of this, and at the same time we're seeing now that they're pushing west of Dibrova and to the south of Kreminna, which means that they likely plan to just move the entire front towards the Serebets River rather than trying any sort of maneuver to outflank or simply pincer the Ukrainian positions. They instead just do frontal assaults. The main reason for this is that we are seeing that the Russians now have a significant artillery advantage. This significant artillery advantage comes from two reasons. The first one is that the Western powers have started sending less and less supplies to Ukraine, military aid mainly, and their production is not at a level which corresponds to what Russia is producing, despite it being only itself. The main reason for this is that the Russians never really completely dismounted the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, while the West largely left and exported their own industry to Asian countries like China and Vietnam and others. As such, China, which is now a Russian ally rather than a Western ally, North Korea, which has a large supply of artillery from the Korean War, and Russia itself, with its Soviet industrial capacity, is now outproducing that of the entire West combined. And therefore, we're seeing that the Russians by themselves are able to stock up and supply their own artillery needs at a much higher rate than that of the Ukrainians, especially since Western countries also need artillery for themselves, because they are also at a fear of getting into a fight themselves. This would mean that without artillery for themselves, then how would they going to defend themselves? The idea right now is that they send almost everything to Ukraine on the idea that Ukraine is defending the West on its behalf. So the Ukrainians are dying for Westerners to not fight in a war. That is, at the very least, the idea that is being spread by US Senator Lindsey Graham and others. But the idea is that in the end, the majority of Western artillery goes to Ukraine, but it is still not enough. The Russians are outproducing, And since the aid has slowed down, especially since the summer, where we have this CNN article that says Ukraine's hopes of victory fade in the face of waning Western support and Putin's relentless war machine, which essentially says exactly that. In a very simple manner, they showcase how a year ago a resolute President Volodymyr Zelensky traveled direct from the battlefield of Bakhmut to address the US Congress and meet with President Joe Biden. He was feted as a hero. Ukraine's determination to resist Russian aggression met with strong bipartisan backing in Washington. 1 year on, the outlook looks much grimmer. A long-anticipated Ukrainian offensive in the south has made scant progress. Russia appears to have weathered international sanctions for now and has converted its economy into a war machine. So they have reopened all of their historical industrial capacity and are now able to outproduce the entire West. That is the reality of the situation, and that is why we're seeing that these advances, the longer, the wider the front is, the more of an advantage the Russians have, because they simply have that much more available to use at the front. The Russian advances here west of Dnipro was confirmed with this geolocated footage here, which shows Russian armored vehicles being under artillery fire of the Ukrainians here to the west of Dnipro. We then move on to the direction of Novohrodivka as the northern flank of Bakhmut, where Russians have been detected here to the northern flank of Novohrodivka and were hit by Ukrainian artillery here as well. After I've just talked about how Ukraine is in a lack of artillery, we see that the Ukrainians have actually increased the amount of artillery they use at the front over the past few weeks. We've seen it here in Novohrodivka, we've seen it in the direction of Dnipro, we've seen it in Sinkivka, and now we're also seeing it in Avdiivka and in the Zaporizhia front. This is likely because they have had a limit that they put on themselves for a couple of weeks, where they would build up and send more ammunition to the front to try and launch a bigger attack, a bigger resistance at some point, which seems to be now, to try and prevent and slow down the momentum of the Russian forces. And we see that it is actually effective, as the Russian advances over the past 2 days have only been one a day, while we compare that to throughout the month, where there has been approximately 130 advances, where the majority are Russian, over 90%. So with this, we see that the Russians have been slowed down, the momentum is down after the Ukrainians started increasing the use of artillery they've used throughout the front line. We also see this geolocated footage in the direction of Avdiivka in the far north, here by the Dacha area, as well as to the north of Stepove in the flank by the forest lines, where we see Russian forces getting hit by artillery. So this isn't just something that I'm putting out there, it is the reality of the situation. But at the same time, we also see that the Russian missile attacks have significantly increased over the past few days. This likely indicates that they themselves have been stocking up on the missiles that they haven't been using for months, and now they're using them in large quantities, where there has been a significant development, and that is how this New York Times article writes how a Russian barrage evaded Ukraine's defenses to wreak deadly chaos. Suddenly, the Russians are evading the majority of the Ukrainian air defense, and as is written in this article, although there are over 120 projectiles were launched over Ukraine, and Ukraine claims to have shot down about 70 or 80 of them, not a single cruise missile was shot down. They claim that the main reason is this footage here, which shows a alleged decoy with flares. This is to completely confuse the air defense systems over Ukraine. Is it going to be a real missile, a decoy missile, and is it going to have flares or not? So direct fire heat-based systems cannot hit the missile, while radar-based guided missiles, air defense missiles, will be able to hit it. But the question is it even a real target, or is it a decoy? And at the same time, it is already difficult to hit these cruise missiles. So in the end, all of this adds up to the Ukrainians having a hard time dealing with the Russian rockets. The Russians have an advantage throughout the front line, but the Ukrainians are currently putting up a very tough fight to prevent further Russian advances by increasing their artillery consumption. But this also speeds up the time it takes before the Ukrainians run out. So this is a strategy that is heavily reliant on further support by the West. So we'll have to see if these budgets and packages for Ukrainian military aid will pass in the EU and the United States over the next couple of weeks or not. And the results of those could have a very heavy impact on the front line. If it passes, the Ukrainians can hold on. If it doesn't, we may see a collapse of the Ukrainian front line, as the Ukrainians will not be able to deal with a constant influx of weapons and artillery ammunitions to the Russians while not having any themselves. It seems that the Ukrainians have this sort of all or nothing mentality where they need to use everything they have, because if they haven't used everything, then they haven't really tried sort of situation. We're seeing this with essentially everything where the Ukrainians are fighting. We saw it in the Kharkiv offensive, where they kept pushing until they couldn't anymore. They did it in Kherson, where they kept pushing until they couldn't anymore. And in the Zaporizhzhia region, where they kept pushing until they couldn't anymore. But this mentality is that of Zelensky, not Zelensky. Zelensky is more balanced. He's holding himself back. He's not there using this all or nothing mentality. But this shows that Zelensky really has a lot of influence in what happens militarily, despite him not being a military person, but instead a civilian president. But in the end, he's the one who is in charge of everything, so in the end, his is what is goes. But in the end, what matters the most is what sort of strategy the Ukrainians use, because in the end, what matters the most is that this is a military analysis channel, not a political analysis channel. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.